I found most of these on the web. They're readily available, and I tried to give you a selection. That's Fukushima, which just happened 4 years ago. Sit down. And then, we'll leave that one up. I didn't mean to start a kind of a prayerful atmosphere, but in fact, it really is, you will want to say, please God, never again. My name is Martha Cameron, and I'm with the Climate Action Committee of Brooklyn for Peace, and I'm going to ask Jonathan to come up and say a few words first from Brooklyn Friends. And I'm going to get out of the way.
Hi, my name is Jonathan Fluck, and I'm with the Peace and Social Action Committee of Brooklyn Friends, and this is our meeting house, and every Sunday we are in this room, and there's a small pamphlet that you might be able to find downstairs that talks about what we do in when we meet for worship. But the Peace and Social Action Committee is very active. Quakers have always realized that faith requires action. And so we're very, very happy to co-sponsor this event, and we hope that there are many others that we can co-sponsor as well. Welcome to the Brooklyn meeting.
And we've worked with Brooklyn Friends Peace and Social Action Committee quite a bit in the past, and it's really wonderful to be in this space again. But before I introduce our two speakers, I'd like to say a couple of things about the issue itself, in addition to the slideshow that you saw. Many people in this room, myself included, cut their movement teeth on the nuclear issue, on nuclear weapons. I'm a strontium 90 baby. It was in my milk when I was growing up. I grew up with the threat of nuclear war, even though I lived in Canada. We didn't hide under the desks, but it was very much a part of my growing up. And it was very much a part of the movement's consciousness from about the 1950s to the early 1980s, But in recent decades, the threat of nuclear war has become sort of a non-issue. The thinking seems to be, well, if it hasn't happened yet, it's not going to. And during most of that time, 1950s to 1980s, I would say most of us were pretty oblivious to the dangers of nuclear power. 3 Mile Island in 1979 was a bit of a jolt, but aside from pictures of some very weird-looking dandelions and a whole bunch of jokes about radioactive chocolate from the Hershey factory, pretty soon the reactor sort of faded into our consciousness. And then along came Chernobyl in 1986. We had a whole bunch of kids staying at our house from Chernobyl, trying to get some kind of treatment for a while. They were 12 years old, every one of them had been exposed. And in 2011, there was Fukushima, and maybe those reactors weren't so benign after all. So today there's a new surge of activity, but most of it that we're aware of these days is around fossil fuels. People are out in the streets every day protesting KXL and fracking and liquefied natural gas and pipelines and condensers and compressor stations. I was at a demonstration today in front of Cuomo's office demanding that we veto Liberty Port Ambrose, which is a proposed LNG station. And we're all calling on churches to divest and reinvest in renewables and go solar and go wind. So this new upsurge in the movement is mostly focused around fossil fuel energy, but it's causing many of us to take a second hard look at the whole nuclear issue. Nuclear power, but also nuclear weapons, and their relationship to climate change and the growing threat of nuclear war. So the work of our two speakers embodies both the connectedness between these, the links between the local and the global. Our first speaker is Marilyn Elie. She's a teacher and a librarian, which happens to be one of my favorite professions, because I regard them as the medieval monks of our time. They're preserving information for the future. She's also a founding member of Indian Point Safe Energy Coalition. And she is definitely a BFP kind of organizer. She's a grassroots organizer who is grounded in the local struggle, but whose perspective is informed by and linked to a network of similar struggles that are going on around the country and around the globe. And our second speaker is Gerson, who works at the global level, but he is vitally connected to the grassroots. He's director of the American Friends Service Committee's Peace and Economic Security Program. He's co-convener of the Peace and Planet Mobilization, which we're going to hear more about later. He's written extensively about nuclear weapons and U.S. foreign policy. And you can find some of his books. His most recent book is out on our literature table. And he works closely with the European and Asian peace movements, as well as with the peace and justice organizations around the United States. Okay, so we have 4 questions, 2 people. We've got one about Israel. We've got one question about what is happening with nuclear power in other countries such as Norway, a question about the water, and a question about TPP. Which one of you wants to go first?
Donna is correct about the relocation. There is a zone around Chernobyl and there is also a zone around Fukushima that are uninhabitable. It varies. There are lots of hot spots, particularly in Fukushima. They are trying, many of the politicians are trying to get people to go back there so that they can pretend and start business as normal. Radiation, well, you saw some of the slides. The people there have their own radiation monitors. They're checking the food they feed to their children. And there have been a very high number of suicides of people who are still in what amounts to relocated housing because of the attachment that these families had to their land and to their houses and family in that area. So they're scattered over. It's very depressing for many of them. And it's a very, very sad situation, and certainly one that we do not need here in New York. and that could happen. In regard to water, when the plant is closed, you would need much less water. Water would be needed for the spent fuel pool, but you just put the water in and replace it, so you wouldn't be using it for cooling purposes. Other countries, as the gentleman said, Denmark, last December, Denmark used 100% renewable energy for all of its electricity production. 100%. In regard to Germany, and I'll be going there in May, so I'm looking forward to finding out and talking to people over there and getting some really clear information. The people in Germany decided that they would accept a surcharge, and for a while they really did pay a very high rate for their electricity. It was a transition. Now their renewable energy is flooding the market. I just spoke with someone who came over from Germany recently, and she said, it's a matter of course. When you buy your house, you put your solar panels on. It's just what you do. So they are steadfast in closing down their plants, and they are steadfast in moving towards a reasonable green energy policy. So.
Okay, so in relationship to Israel, Israel got the nuclear weapon essentially as a consolation prize. The Brits and the French lured Israel into attacking Egypt in 1956. The war didn't go well, and the consolation prize was that France helped Israel develop a nuclear weapon. Interestingly, Israel had a nuclear weapon in Diamona by 1967. I actually had the privilege of working with an incredibly courageous man who was Israel's #3 general at the time, who later became the strongest advocate in Israel for Palestine rights. And what was clear was that the Israelis felt they wanted to go first. They knew what they could do. I mean, they tried to avoid Johnson's mediation, but they were also concerned that if it came to war, that the Egyptians might attack Diamona, so they wanted to make sure they got it first. Oh, I'm sorry, TPP. So as Don was saying, I mean, this is like NAFTA on steroids. It becomes an international treaty, and if it's respected, unlike maybe the NPT, then it supersedes U.S. law and regulations, whether it's the environment, whether it's workers' rights, on down the line. And as you said, they can sue and win. So it's a tremendous loss of sovereignty, it's a tremendous loss of rights, it's a race to the bottom. There's another dimension to it, and Hillary Clinton has commented on it. It's also a strategic treaty. It's not only about the money. It's about bringing Japan and South Korea and Vietnam, the other countries, much more into the U.S. sphere, not only economically, but socially. The idea, and linguistically. And the idea is, in the competition with China, the United States is moving to try to draw their societies to identify with the United States, less with China, as we move to surround and, can't exactly isolate China, but to surround and contain China. I mean, the whole thing is being negotiated in secret. I think there's 600 companies that have people who see the text. Members of the U.S. Congress can't even see the text. And as you were saying, the trick is to try to prevent fast track, because at fast track, if the treaty comes up, the members of Congress won't really not have read the details. They've got to vote up or down. It means no amendments. If there are amendments, that means the whole thing has to go back and be renegotiated, which is what the government wants to avoid, and that the corporations want to avoid. So, I mean, with the comment we had with Clinton with NAFTA, right, you're going to have some kind of combination of the conservative Democrats and Republicans trying to push this thing through.
Indian Point is up for relicensing. It's been a long 5-year struggle, the longest struggle for any reactor in the history of this country. So thank you very much to those of you who have been working on that. That's why, because of the grassroots support. You have a resolution that will be coming up before your city council shortly about closing Indian Point, and I hope everybody in here, when you hear about it, will be talking to your city council member about supporting that resolution. Bill de Blasio has not taken a position. I don't know what he thinks, but he needs to be lobbied. Where are we? Well, DEC is trying to do closed cycle cooling. If they can't, if Indian Point will not go to closed cycle cooling, that's one route to closing it. There are several others. Contentions are still pending. It's a big court case. It's a big mess. I won't bore you with the details except to say it has to go before, no matter what the judges that are hearing all this stuff say, it still has to go before the NRC. Guess what they're going to say? It's safe, no danger to the public, keep it open. After that, and what the lawyers are doing right now is laying grounds for an appeals in the appellate court. After that, it will go to the appellate court. I wish I had more grassroots information for you and more things that you could do. The action is to support the governor and thank him because he has been adamant about closing Indian Point. He's put a lot of things in place that will close it, like REV and the Energy Highway. So it's important to know about those things, to tell people about them, and to dispel the myth that we need the power from Indian Point. We do not.
I don't want to, scare you any further, but we're going to have to love each other or we're going to die. But the question is, Ukraine with 15 nuclear plants and the fighting still going on, isn't that a little shaky, Joseph?
Yeah, so look, any place you have a nuclear power plant, it's shaky. I mean, last night I loved listening to the one about the talk about the Plymouth plant, which is basically the fifth least reliable one in the United States, right? People have been able to walk into the control area. They were able to take a helicopter right over the area where they've got all the fuel rods. So any nuclear plant is, if not functionally a nuclear bomb, it's functionally a Chernobyl or a Fukushima, and in time of war things get crazy. While I have the mic, I just want to kind of reinforce what Rusty was saying, just in terms of the insanity of the opposition to the negotiations with Iran. To appreciate it's not about whether, the opposition is not about a nuclear weapon. The opposition is that they want to keep Iran down with sanctions. They want to keep it weak for the longer term. And others have got their agendas with Obama. To think in terms of where this leads, right, is the possibility of yet another catastrophic war. It's insane. And so just to reinforce that we need to get all the calls in that we can. In Massachusetts, we're dealing principally with Markey, who in some areas is progressive, but on Israel he's been terrible. And I mean, it's an existential question, right? If I could just say for a moment to this woman here, it is depressing stuff. We live in a country, in a world, in which we have a plutocracy, we have citizens united, we have a military-industrial complex, we have a history of imperialism. Lord knows we've got a history of racism, right? Our responsibility is to deal with the world that we're in, and not ask for something that's not there. I mean, we need to ask for something that's not there. We need to press for it, but we need to deal with reality as it is. And also, just one more thing to say, is the number of times in our lives when we've seen that struggle has made change, right? I mean, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, how many of us couldn't imagine the end of apartheid, right? I mean, so many times we have the collapse of the Berlin Wall, right? Out of people's movements, things come when you least expect them, but you've got to be steadfast if that's going to happen.
So my question, though, for you, sir, is what kind of pressure are other countries, our so-called allies, putting on the United States to get them to reduce the 7,000 nuclear weapons, at least to the United States? Hopefully there will also be pressure put on these countries like this to reduce their nuclear weapons as well. But the United States is probably the biggest threat to world peace that exists.
So I think the biggest pressure is an unwillingness to sign on a final document in the NPT that lets things go forward, unless there's a really serious commitment by the United States and the other nuclear powers. In a sense, it's also kind of the game of chicken. If the United States won't move, then maybe the NPT collapses. And if the NPT collapses, we face even worse dangers. So I think that's at one level the ultimate kind of pressure that they have. You've had these other, you've had like the human consequences conferences, open-ended, I mean, all kinds of diplomatic processes. And it was amazing to see in Vienna, the senior U.S. diplomat who was there committed an amazing faux pas. I mean, it's like everybody wanted to crawl under their chairs. And, this is the kind of, well, let's just say what it was. After the people had given the experts had given their talks, and Ellen Thomas had given her talk, the chair of the conference says, "This is a time for questions and answers. Statements can be made tomorrow." That's when the government's making statements. Who is the first out of the block? It is the U.S. representative who says, "We have a statement to make." And it was the most defensive, stupid kind of response to it. Everybody wanted to crawl under their chairs. Well, this is the kind of thing that reduces the credibility and the influence of the United States over time. But the most fundamental thing is to say, we're not signing on. We're not going to play this game of illusion anymore. And that has enormous consequences for the exercise of that kind of empire that Brzezinski was outlining.
Yeah, I noticed in the newspaper that this treaty with Iran was being negotiated with the U.S., Russia, China, Britain, and France. And obviously those were the first 5 nuclear powers, right? So in this case, it was fascinating. You talked about diplomatic isolation of the U.S. and nuclear powers. I guess this is one case where we are supporting those nuclear powers in their agenda in this one with the Iran treaty. But I also wanted to know who are the 9, you mentioned 9 powers, because there's Pakistan, India, and Israel, and who's the 9th? Oh, North Korea, okay.
So only say the other country involved there is Germany. And these are also, there's also the P5 of the Security Council. And what you have playing here is realpolitik, right? China has an interest here in terms of trade. Russia has a lot of interest. So the negotiations are quite complex. You can be sure there have been some secret deals worked out that we're not going to hear about for 30 years. But that's the way diplomacy works. So it's not in any of these nations' interest to have another nuclear power, right? Russia doesn't want a nuclear Iran on its borders. Europe doesn't want a nuclear Iran on its borders. So what are the trade-offs in this besides the sanctions? There've got to be, and you've got personal connections between diplomats. So it works in a complex kind of way.
In educating people about the nuclear situation, especially nuclear power, I think it's helpful to, make people realize that it's essentially a health issue. Nuclear power is a health issue. It's not a political, I mean, it's a political issue too, but it's essentially it's a health issue in the long term. And just one last comment.
There's no education in high schools about that.
Ralph Nader put it very well. Any nuclear plant in the country just needs one bad day.
What I'm going to say is, look, I'm Jewish. I was born in 1946. When I grew up around the dinner table, the question was, what should the German people have really done? How did they turn their heads away? How did they participate in the process of silence, right? I think probably everybody in this room, it was most important to you is not only your own life, but of your loved ones, your children, your grandchildren, right? The dangers of nuclear catastrophe are huge. They're huge, and we're accelerating. So what I come down to is the question, not only nuclear weapons, but it's also the drone wars, the secret wars in the Philippines, what the NSA is doing to all of us. The question is, if we think that we need to act for human survival, then we need to take some risk. We need to put our life energies into it. I mean, what is more important? Going to the movies? or serving human life.